So if you do have any questions that are specific to this PDM webinar or any general PDM questions, feel free to type those in the chat box as they come up. So you don't forget, I will address those at the end of the webinar just so we can get through the material without too much distraction, but I will be sure to get to those questions once the content is done. So as we get started here, I want to just give you an overview of the current PDM offerings from SOLIDWORKS. As most of you know and are probably using it, there's the Workgroup PDM option. And if you don't already know, that product will no longer be included as part of the 2018 release of SOLIDWORKS. So in previous releases of SOLIDWORKS, Workgroup was part of that download package that you would have gotten. But with the 2018 release, there's the end of life for that product, so that will no longer be included. So with that, obviously, we need to figure out what you want to do with that data. Do you want to perform a data migration over to one of the other offerings that SOLIDWORKS has for PDM? Or do you want to leave it there as a reference? So if you do decide that you want to do a data migration, what are the other offerings that SOLIDWORKS has for PDM? So the first one is SOLIDWORKS PDM Standard, and this was released as part of the 2016 SOLIDWORKS release. This is intended sort of as the default replacement for Workgroup PDM because licenses come bundled as part of your SOLIDWORKS Pro and Premium seats that you might already have. So you'll have those licenses by default if you have Pro and Premium seats. And part of the reason why they made this switch is it's actually based off of the PDM Professional architecture, so it operates in the same way. And then if you decide that you want to scale up to PDM Professional, it's much easier to do that. Moving from Workgroup to PDM Standard or Professional currently involves a data migration, and it's a somewhat complex process. So obviously that brings us to our third option, or I guess our second option for upgrade here, which is PDM Professional. And this is the full version of the PDM software that SOLIDWORKS offers. And in this case, with PDM Professional, it was actually rebranded from Enterprise PDM in the 2016 release. And part of that was because we have a lot of smaller customers who require the functionality that PDM Professional provides, but were scared off by having Enterprise in the product title. So they removed that so they weren't putting off any potential customers because they might not consider themselves a fit for an enterprise level software. And again, the difference between the PDM Professional and Standard softwares, the Standard has some of the same functionality that Pro does, but Professional is the full version. I'm not going to talk about all of the differences between PDM Standard and PDM Professional, but if you do go to the Hawk Ridge Systems website and go to the PDM page, there is a View Matrix button, and that will show you a full breakdown of what the differences are between PDM Standard and PDM Professional. So hopefully that'll give you a good idea of what those differences are. But again, that's not the topic for the webinar today. So we'll continue on. So next I'm going to talk about some product differences. So with Workgroup PDM, we have a 32-bit architecture that's used for this program. So what that means is there's only so much RAM that can be allocated for certain processes. There's only so much memory that you can use with this system. And what that means is as you start to scale this program, so as you're adding more and more users who might be accessing this program, you can start to see some performance issues. And this is opposed to SOLIDWORKS PDM, whether it's Standard or Professional. These are both based on 64-bit architecture. So again, that means that you have more memory that can be used by this system, which makes it more efficient and faster to use. Also with Workgroup PDM, there is no database in the background. So it's simply storing these files that you're designing in a folder structure, which obviously isn't the most efficient for referencing them. And if you need to search for that information later on, because it's simply stored in folders, it's not going to be very fast to go through and search for data in that sort of structure. But with the SQL database, there is in PDM Standard and Professional, that allows you to manage all of the information about the files or metadata information. That's all handled by that SQL database. And because of that, it runs more efficiently and more quickly, and you can locate information inside this system much more quickly than you would in the Workgroup PDM system. And depending on the type of PDM that you have, whether it's PDM Standard or PDM Professional, there is an Express SQL instance that you could have, or the standard SQL instance. And this can get a little bit confusing here. With SQL Express, that is the free version of the software, and that's what you would use if you were using PDM Standard. Again, because those PDM Standard licenses come with your Pro and Premium seats, they needed to have a free offering of SQL. But because this is the free version of the software, there are some limitations to that. For example, you can only use up to a gigabyte of memory on the Express instance. So again, as you're adding more and more users, there is a potential to see some performance degradation. Whereas SQL Standard is actually the full version of the software, and that's what comes with your professional installation. So again, the only real limitation with that SQL Standard version is depending on however much memory you've allocated for the machine that's running SQL, that will determine how fast it can run. Also, in terms of how you interact with the system, with Workgroup, there is a SOLIDWORKS Explorer interface that you're using, and this is how you're going in and working with files. And it's a little bit less intuitive than, say, Windows Explorer interface that most people are used to working in. And that's actually what SOLIDWORKS PDM Standard and Professional are both based in. They have a Windows Explorer interface. So if you're used to moving files around with a copy and paste or a drag and drop, that can all be done very easily, and that learning curve is significantly less, again, because you're working in an environment that you're already used to. So there's also some updated terminology. So what were things called inside Workgroup, and what are they now called in SOLIDWORKS PDM? So one of the first things that I'm going to mention here is when you want to access a file, there is a checkout option. So that's simply to view the file. So that's what it was called in Workgroup. There is a open/checkout option. And to perform that same action inside SOLIDWORKS PDM Standard or Professional, you use a get operation. Then once you want to edit the file, there is a take ownership option that you can use. And with the take ownership option, again, you're getting edit access to that file. That same operation in PDM Standard and Professional is called checkout, and that's giving you that edit access to a file. Also, as you're taking ownership or checking out a file and making edits to that file and then bringing it back into the Workgroup vault, you're creating a new revision of that file. And doing that same process inside PDM Standard and Professional, instead of creating a revision, we'll create what's called a version. So some customers don't like the fact that this system is burning through multiple revisions every time they're editing that file. So PDM Standard and Professional instead has a version which is created upon check-in of a changed file. And then we'll see that the revision is only applied after a file has gone through some sort of approval process, which is actually this next term here. In Workgroup, we can set up life cycles, which are our approval processes, and they're built in so that we can move the file from one step in the approval process to the next. And inside PDM Standard and Professional, that same process is called a workflow. And it actually gives us a better visualization as to what the order of the process is and the different steps along that process. So now that we've talked about some of the updated terminology, let's take a look at what this actually looks like in practice. So I'm going to go ahead and open up SOLIDWORKS, and let me close this out here. And inside SOLIDWORKS, you'll see that I have actually two PDM icons. So the top one here is my Workgroup PDM icon, and it actually looks very, very similar to my PDM Professional icon here. So I'll try to make sure and not get these confused. But if I open up my Workgroup tab, we'll see that I'm logged into my vault, and I have this miter saw assembly that I'm going to be looking at. And again, the process to open a file inside Workgroup, that's a checkout. So I'm going to check out that file. And inside this window, because I'm simply viewing this file at this time, that's what this is going to allow. If I did also want to edit it, I could take ownership using this checkbox, and that will allow me to edit the file. Or if I wanted to grab any previous revisions, I could also grab that as well. But in this case, I'm just going to stick with the latest. So I'll go ahead and check that out. And that's going to open up the file. And now once that file is open, if I want to make an edit to that file, I'll right-click on it, and I'll go down to take ownership. So again, that's what's going to give me the edit access to that file. And then from here, if I want to check out any of the child parts as well that appear under that assembly, I can do that. Or I can just check out the main assembly. So let's take a look at what that same process looks like inside PDM Standard and Professional. And just a disclaimer here, I do have PDM Professional. That's what I'm going to be working in for this webinar. But pretty much everything that I'm going to show is going to be the same between Standard and Professional. So to open a file from my PDM Pro Vault, I'll just go to my Open button up at the top here. And I'm already logged into my vault. So we'll see that I'll have my miter saw assembly here that I want to work with. And I'll go ahead and open that. And a checkout dialog popped up on my other screen, so I'll drag it over. And we'll see that it's prompting me to check out the file. But again, if I just want to get read-only access to the file at this time, I can deselect that checkout option, but I'm still doing that get operation, which will allow me to view the file. And then I'll hit checkout. So now I have my file here. And then if I would like to make edits to it, instead of take ownership, we have a checkout option up in our PDM add-in here on the right-hand side. So from there, I could select this document or any of these other documents for that matter that I might want to check out and make edits to. So I'll go ahead and check that out. And again, I get that same checkout dialog. And this time I do want to make edits to the file. So I'll go ahead and make sure that that checkout box is selected. And just like with Workgroup, if we want to choose any child parts that are under this assembly, we can check those out as well. So I'll go ahead and check that out. And because I'm logged in as the admin, we'll see in this checked out by column that the admin name shows up. So any other users that might be using the system will clearly see that I have this file checked out and I'm making some sort of edits to it. So now let's take a look at what happens if I make a change to this file. So if I were to go to this blade cover and I want to change this to be transparent, and then I'll go ahead and save that change, we'll see that when I go to check in this file, and we'll see that that check-in option is located just to the right of that checkout option, we'll see that it's going to create a new version of this file. So instead of creating that new revision like we saw in Workgroup, or which we will see in a minute here, it's creating a new version instead. And you'll also notice, and this is a recent feature that they just added with the 2017 release, is the ability to overwrite latest version. So that was a big thing that a lot of Workgroup customers wanted and really liked from Workgroup. So they've incorporated that into PDM Standard and Professional as well. So if you want to overwrite that latest version, so instead of creating version 18, it would just overwrite version 17. That is an option now inside PDM Standard and Pro. So I'll go ahead and check that in, and we'll see that it's moved to version 18. So now let's go and take a look at what that looks like back in Workgroup. So I already have ownership of this file, so I'm going to make that same change. I'm going to change the opacity of this blade cover. And after I've made that change, I'll go ahead and save it. And then if I go to write this edit back to the Vault copy so that anybody else can see that, we'll see that there is this check-in active document. And we'll see that it's going to bump that revision. So again, instead of a version like there is in PDM Standard and Pro, we have the revision updating from A-06, where it currently is, to A-07. And if I were using a simple alpha scheme ABCD, it would move that letter value to the next letter value. And again, if I am done making edits to this file at this time, I can deselect this retain ownership, and that's going to save me another right click, because otherwise if I leave this box selected and hit check in, I still technically have ownership of this file, so I would need to right click on that file and choose release ownership. So then anybody else who wanted to and had the permissions to could then access this file. The next thing that I want to talk about is the difference between the lifecycle and workflow inside Workgroup and inside PDM Standard and Professional. So if I open up my Workgroup Vault admin tool, we'll see that there is a lifecycle tab here. And on this lifecycle tab, we have different lifecycle statuses on the left-hand side. And we'll see with each of these lifecycle statuses, there are different permissions that we can assign to different users. So if I go to my pending approval, we'll see that I have removed read and write access from some of these users. That's what's indicated with RW or RO for read-only. And then we'll see once the files move to approved that the write permissions have been removed from everybody except the admin to prevent people from editing a released file. The problem with this, though, is it's a little bit hard to visualize. In this case, we can logically figure out the order of these lifecycle statuses, or the order in which they should occur, probably work in process, then pending approval, and finally approved. But it's not totally clear because we can actually move this file from one workflow or rather lifecycle status to another one in any order we want. Whereas in Workgroup, it's a little bit clearer as to what's happening. So if I open up the PDM admin tool, we'll see that we have a very similar approval process. In this case, instead of a life cycle, we call it a workflow. And just like our life cycle, we have different approval or different states in this workflow, and these are the different steps in our approval process. And this is going to give us a much better or much clearer idea of the order in which these steps should occur, as well as the different options that we have. So files start off in work in process, they move to pending approval, and then finally they go to approved. In that order, unless there are changes required. So again, because we have this visualization, this helps us to much better define what that workflow process is and the steps in the order that they should occur. So let's look at what it looks like to move the file from one lifecycle status to the next, and then we'll look at the PDM workflow as well. So if I right-click on my Workgroup Vault assembly here, and I want to change that lifecycle status, there's an option in the right-click menu there. And we'll see that it's currently in pending approval. If I want to move it to approved, I can do that. I could also move it to work in process. So again, because we don't have that visualization that we do inside PDM Standard and Pro, it can be a little bit harder to understand if we have a very complex workflow, the order in which those steps should occur. But if I go over to my PDM file, so let me bring that back up again. The process for moving those files is similar. We have a state change menu, and again, the state is referring to the different workflow states or the different steps in our approval process. And we can actually see in this window that workflow state that the file is currently in. So at the moment, it's sitting in pending approval. So if I want to move that file to approved, we'll see that I have a transition line that will allow me to move that to the next workflow state. And again, because we have that workflow laid out the way that we do, we'll only have transitions that are appropriate for the particular workflow state that this file is in. So I'll go ahead and choose approved. And we'll notice that when we approve this file, that the revision is going to update from D to E. So again, that's the process of adding a revision inside PDM. Instead of using the revision as the incrementer whenever the file is changed, in PDM Standard and Professional, the version is what increments as the file is changed, and then only once a file has gone through some sort of approval process does the revision actually update. So again, this will help you control the number of revisions that you create because they're applied as part of that workflow process. And we'll see that it's moved to E now. So now that we've discussed some of the updated terminology and some of the updated operations inside PDM Standard and Pro, moving from Workgroup, let's talk about what our options are moving forward. So after the 2018 release, when Workgroup is no longer included as part of the SOLIDWORKS download, what are you planning on doing with that vault data that's currently stored there? So one option is to leave your Workgroup data as a historic file archive, and that will allow you to leave the files basically as is for future reference. So you don't have to really do anything, but you'll also have to basically stay at whatever release of SOLIDWORKS you were at when you had Workgroup installed. So at that point, what you would do is leave your Workgroup vault, and then any new data that you design and create would then be put into some either PDM Standard or PDM Professional system that you have set up, and then you would just go back and reference those files from time to time as needed. Another option is pulling the latest revision. So the latest revision inside Workgroup is obviously whichever is the latest version of that file, and you can pull those over as necessary. But with that latest revision pull, obviously you're not going to get the entire file revision history, which can be a problem for some customers. Other customers, that might be acceptable. But what that actually looks like in practice, and we'll talk about why it's only the latest revision that can be pulled, is if I close out of my presentation here and open up a Windows Explorer view, because again, the workgroup files are stored in Windows Explorer. So I'll go to my C drive, and on my C drive I have a Vault Data folder. And in my Vault Data folder I have a Projects folder and Engineering Files, and this is where that miter saw assembly is stored that I was looking at before. And you'll see that I have a folder for each of my assemblies and parts here. And if I open up this folder, I'll see that I have different folders for the different revisions of that file. But unfortunately, inside these folders, there isn't a standard SLD ASM file that I can just grab and pull out of this system. So it's not an easy process for getting all of your data out of Workgroup and into PDM Standard or Professional. But what you can do, again, if you want to pull only the latest versions over, or latest revisions, I should say, there is this latest folder, and in that folder, these files do exist in their regular form, SLD ASM, SLD PRT. So at that point, you could pull these files over, but obviously in doing that, you're not necessarily going to have all of the previous revisions of that file that exist, or all of the property information that exists for that file. So what happens if you do want all of that information, so all of the file history and all of the previous revisions of that file? So the third option here is doing a full migration. And just a disclaimer here, this is a VAR-only process. So if you are interested in doing something like this, please contact Hawkridge Systems. And what this is going to allow is all of your property information that might exist for your files that are in Workgroup can be pulled over and mapped into PDM Standard or Professional. And it's also going to make sure that any of those revisions or iterations of the file that exists inside Workgroup are also pulled over. So you're not left with just the latest revision. You actually have all of those previous revisions that you can go back and access inside PDM Standard or Professional. So what this process, this full migration process actually looks like, there are some initial steps where obviously you want to contact Hawkridge, and then we can have some phone calls to discuss what your data situation looks like and what your plans are moving forward. And as part of that, we're going to run a Vault audit. So we have an audit tool that can be sent, which will look at the complexity of the data that you have, the amount of data that you have, the amount of information that's stored about those files inside Workgroup. And that will help us get a better idea of how long it might take to run this migration process and who to assign it. And once we have a better idea of what your Vault data looks like and what your plans are moving forward, then we can talk about setting up a timeline for testing and assigning somebody to handle that migration. And once that's done, the server can be set up at that point. So as part of that, SQL will be installed, and the PDM, either Standard or Professional software, will be installed and configured so that all of your property information from Workgroup has somewhere to map into or plug into inside the PDM Standard or Pro environment, as well as bringing in some other settings to make sure that your life cycles possibly are also mapped into a corresponding workflow inside of the PDM environment. Also around this time, we want to have admin training done. So the admin training is what allows you to understand all of the different settings that can be adjusted on the back end of PDM. So creating those workflows, understanding how to do permission changes and settings changes if people run into issues using PDM. This is going to give you a full background of all the configuration that can be done to the PDM Standard and Pro vaults. Then once that's done, we'll set up a test migration. So we're going to bring maybe not all of your files, but maybe a portion of your files from your workgroup vault, and we'll run a test migration, bringing them into either the PDM Standard or Professional environment. And with that, if there are files that there are issues with, maybe they weren't checked in before that migration was started, we'll let you know any files that we had issues with, but we're also looking for feedback from the customer at this point as well. So after that test migration, we want the customer to do some validation as well to confirm that the files that they had in Workgroup are acting the same way as they did inside the new PDM Standard and Pro environment, as well as doing just general testing to the vault to confirm that everything is configured the way that they want it to be. And at a minimum, we're going to recommend at least a week of testing, potentially 2, depending on the complexity of the system. But some customers do take more time than that. And again, that's based upon the amount of time you want to put into that testing phase and making sure that that's a priority for you. Also, at that point, once we've confirmed that everything is working the way that you want, we can talk about the actual production migration. So at that point, we might have a practice migration of the production data. So in the test migration, because we may have only done a portion of that data, with the production migration practice, we're going to actually take the full data set this time and run that production migration practice. And that will probably take place over a weekend to ensure that we're not preventing anybody from doing their actual work. But once that practice is done and we've confirmed that everything came over properly, we've received feedback from you confirming that all of the files that were expected to be there are actually there in the new PDM Standard or Pro environment. Then we can do the actual production migration. And again, we may do that over a weekend or overnight, depending on the complexity of the vault and the number of files in that workgroup system. And once that production migration is actually completed, then we can do a user training, which, as opposed to the admin training, the user training is much simpler, and it's talking about just general use. How do you get inside the PDM environment and work effectively? How do you check out documents? How do you get previous versions of documents and move files through the workflow? And both the user training and the admin training are something that Hawkwood System offers. And if that's something you are considering as part of that migration process, again, contact us and we can talk about scheduling those trainings. So again, moving forward at the after this 2017 release and with the 2018 release, that will be the last, the end of life for Workgroup. So again, moving forward, you have to make sure that you're considering your options for what you want to do with that vault group data after the 2018 release, whether you leave it as is or pull those latest revisions, or if you're considering a full migration, And again, that's something that we can handle at Hawkridge. So if you are considering that, please make sure to reach out and indicate that that is something you're interested in pursuing. Other than that, that is all the content I have for you today. Thank you very much for attending. If you do have any questions, feel free to type those in the chat box now, and we can address those. If not, again, thank you very much for attending, and good luck moving forward from Workgroup, and hopefully it's a smooth transition.